The iron portcullis groans as it slams shut, plunging the castle courtyard into uneasy silence. A man, shackled in heavy chains, is dragged forward by armored guards, his pleas echoing against the stone walls. Torches flicker in the damp air, casting monstrous shadows across the keep. Onlookers, both noble and peasant, press forward to catch a glimpse of what fate awaits him. For this is no ordinary trial, it is a spectacle. From the dungeons beneath the castle, an array of cruel instruments gleam faintly in the firelight. The stretching frame of the rack, the iron embrace of the heretic's fork, the grim silhouette of the breaking wheel. Each device tells a story, not just of punishment, but of power. In the medieval imagination, the castle was not merely a fortress of stone, but a theatre of justice, where authority was displayed not in words, but in pain. What modern audiences might recoil from as barbaric medieval rulers considered an essential performance of order. Castles, those towering symbols of feudal dominance, doubled as courts, prisons, and execution grounds. Their halls echoed not only with feasts and songs of chivalry, but with screams that reminded subjects of their place in the social hierarchy. As the chronicler William of Newburgh once observed of his own century, justice was never blind in our time. She was theatrical, and she was cruel. Castles as centers of punishment and power. Before we examine the grisly devices themselves, we must understand why castles became such central stages for human suffering. The medieval castle was far more than a military stronghold. It was the seat of feudal authority, a microcosm of the Lord's power, and the visible reminder of who ruled and who obeyed. To build a castle was to carve a statement into the landscape. Here stands authority, and it is unassailable. But authority, once established, required constant reinforcement. Punishment was that reinforcement. In a world where literacy was rare and proclamations carried little weight among commoners, pain was the language everyone understood. The whipping post in the castle yard, the gallows at the gates, the cages suspended from towers, all spoke more clearly than any parchment decree. When the condemned screamed, the crowd learned. Castles provided not only the security to hold prisoners, but the architecture to stage their discipline. The dungeon beneath, dark and damp, instilled fear even before torture began. The courtyard, broad and open, became an amphitheatre for executions. Tower battlements displayed rotting heads and quartered limbs as messages to travellers and rebels. Punishment was carefully choreographed, an extension of the Lord's political theatre. Consider the words of the 12th century cleric John of Salisbury, who wrote in his Polycraticus, "The prince is the image of God upon earth, and punishment is his rod. Without it, subjects grow insolent and disorderly." For the medieval mind, cruelty was not excess, it was necessity. Moreover, the castle, unlike the city square, embodied exclusivity. Whereas towns had communal whipping posts and pillories, the castle punished with an aura of sanctity. Here, under the gaze of knights, clergy, and sometimes even royalty, the condemned faced judgment that was not only legal, but symbolic of divine order. From this perspective, punishment was as much ritual as it was retribution. To be chained in a dungeon was to descend into a symbolic underworld. To be executed in a courtyard was to offer one's body as a warning and sacrifice for the health of the community. The theatre of justice extended even into architecture. Many medieval castles contained special chambers designed not for defense, but for incarceration and torment. Oubliettes, narrow vertical shafts where prisoners were dropped and forgotten, were less about practicality than psychological terror. The very existence of such pits whispered to every visitor, the Lord has power not only to kill, but to erase. Punishments in castles thus cannot be separated from their performative context. They were as much about spectacle as about crime, and that spectacle began most notoriously with the rack. The rack, stretching the limits of humanity. If one device epitomizes medieval cruelty in the popular imagination, it is the rack, a frame of wood and iron designed to dislocate joints and tear muscles until the victim's own body betrayed him. The rack's structure was deceptively simple, a rectangular wooden frame with rollers at each end, connected by ropes to the prisoner's wrists and ankles. At the turn of a wheel or crank, the rollers rotated, pulling the limbs in opposite directions. At first, the effect was agonizing but survivable. Yet, as the turns continued, ligaments snapped, shoulders and hips dislocated, and skin tore under the strain. Eventually, the victim's body became a grotesque parody of itself, limbs extended far beyond natural proportion. Unlike executions, the rack was not always designed to kill. Its true purpose was confession. In an age where truth was believed to reveal itself under duress, torture was a legitimate tool of justice. Medieval judges and inquisitors held that God would prevent an innocent man from perjuring himself, even under the worst agonies. Thus, if a prisoner confessed on the rack, his guilt was confirmed. If he resisted, his suffering testified to divine protection, or so the theory went. The rack became especially notorious during the Inquisitions of the 13th and 14th centuries, when heresy was considered not merely a crime against the state, but an assault on the soul of Christendom itself. Castles throughout Europe became sites of inquisitorial torment, where accused heretics were stretched until they named fellow conspirators, or died refusing. Chroniclers provide chilling accounts. One 15th century German record describes a woman accused of witchcraft who endured the rack 3 times, each session lasting until her shoulders separated from their sockets. Though she never confessed, her silence was interpreted as proof of witchcraft, and she was burned regardless. The rack's symbolism extended beyond the chamber. Victims who survived often emerged crippled, their twisted bodies serving as living warnings. A bent spine or dangling arm announced not only that the Lord's justice had been done, but that the victim had been branded by authority for life. The English chronicler Raphael Holinshed noted in his chronicles that the rack stretcheth out the sinews of the most stubborn until truth is wrung from their mouths as wine from the grape. The metaphor is telling. Confession was not spoken, but squeezed. Perhaps the most infamous rack in history stood in the Tower of London, itself a castle fortress symbolic of royal authority. Known as the Duke of Exeter's daughter, this rack was introduced under the reign of Henry IV and used against traitors, rebels, and those suspected of plotting against the crown. Even noble prisoners were not spared. Guy Fawkes, the conspirator of the gunpowder plot, was so broken by the rack that his signature on his confession appeared as little more than a trembling scrawl. What made the rack truly horrifying was not only the pain it inflicted, but the psychology it embodied. It transformed the human body into parchment, to be stretched and written upon by authority. The joints became inklines, the screams a royal decree. In the castle dungeon, truth was not discovered, but manufactured through agony. Yet the rack was only one instrument in a vast repertoire. In some castles, a crueler fate awaited, punishment by the Iron Maiden, that sinister sarcophagus bristling with spikes. The Iron Maiden, the embrace of death. Few images of medieval cruelty chill the imagination as vividly as the Iron Maiden, a towering coffin of metal lined with spikes, promising the victim a final embrace of agony. To step into its cold, enclosing frame was to step into a tomb before death. The device was typically shaped like a human figure, often adorned with the serene or mocking visage of a saint or the Virgin Mary on its exterior. But once the heavy door creaked open, its interior revealed a forest of sharpened spikes protruding from every surface. When the prisoner was pushed inside and the door slammed shut, those spikes pierced flesh, not to kill instantly, but to puncture in calculated places: the abdomen, the chest, the shoulders, the thighs. The victim was rarely impaled fatally. Instead, the spikes were positioned to miss vital organs while ensuring deep, bleeding wounds. Thus, the condemned remained alive, bleeding, gasping, and immobilized, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, until blood loss, shock, or infection finally claimed them. The Iron Maiden was, above all, a punishment of theatre. It was designed not only to kill, but to terrify. Its doors could be opened mid-torture, revealing the bloodied prisoner to onlookers before slamming shut again with a metallic clang that echoed through the castle's stone halls. This sound, iron striking iron, was itself a message of finality, as if the very castle walls conspired in the victim's suffering. The medieval mind understood symbolism deeply, and the maiden embodied multiple layers of meaning. By shaping the coffin as a female figure, often with maternal or holy features, the device perverted the notion of protection and nurture. Where the Virgin's arms might cradle the faithful, the Iron Maiden's embrace delivered only torment. It was a blasphemous parody of mercy, turning comfort into cruelty. Accounts of the Iron Maiden's use are fragmentary and often disputed by historians. Some argue that the device, as popularly imagined, was a later invention or exaggeration of earlier spike-lined coffins. Yet whether myth or reality, its legend spread across Europe, and with it, the psychological weight of fear. For in punishment, the idea of the device was nearly as powerful as its actual employment. One of the earliest references comes from Nuremberg in the early 16th century, where a maiden was reportedly used to execute coin forgers. Chroniclers claim that the condemned were slowly pressed into the spiked chamber, their screams filling the town square as the crowd looked on. Whether embellished or not, such tales circulated widely, reinforcing the authority of rulers who could command such terrors. Even if rare, the Iron Maiden captured imaginations precisely because it represented the total domination of body and spirit. Unlike the rack, which demanded confession, the maiden required nothing. It was pure punishment, wordless, inevitable, and absolute. The traveller Johann Philipp Siebenkees, writing in the late 18th century, described the Nuremberg maiden with horror, noting how its spikes were so arranged as to pierce the flesh without immediately touching the heart, the eyes, or the vital parts. His account, though centuries after the Middle Ages, cemented the device's reputation in modern minds as the archetypal torture instrument of the medieval castle. But even if actual Iron Maidens were rarer than popular culture suggests, they fit neatly into the medieval repertoire of symbolic punishment. Castles themselves were structures of fear, looming above peasant villages as reminders of lordly might. To imagine within those walls a device that mocked the embrace of the Virgin or the coffin of the dead was entirely consistent with the age's dark marriage of religion and violence. The maiden was not only about killing, it was about erasing hope. Inside its narrow cavity, the victim could not move, not even to struggle. Each breath brought new pain as wounds rubbed against unyielding metal. The body became a silent relic of suffering, entombed in iron before burial. This spectacle resonated with medieval audiences accustomed to allegory. If hell was the ultimate punishment of sin, then the Iron Maiden was its earthly rehearsal, a body trapped in torment, surrounded by darkness, pierced from every side, with no escape but death. And yet, the Iron Maiden was only one instrument in a gallery of horrors. Some punishments, unlike the Iron Maiden, were not confined to chambers, but displayed boldly in castle courtyards and roadsides, where the populace could witness their cruel lessons daily. Among these, none was more notorious or more spectacular than the breaking wheel.
The breaking wheel, bones shattered for justice. If the Iron Maiden represented the claustrophobic terror of the castle dungeon, the breaking wheel embodied punishment in its most public and theatrical form. Unlike the hidden chambers of torture, the wheel was always a spectacle, staged in the open air for all to see. The breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel, though its association with the saint is later legend, was a massive wooden cartwheel, often taller than a man. The condemned was tied to its spokes, arms and legs spread grotesquely across its circumference. Then, before a gathered crowd, the executioner raised an iron cudgel or hammer and systematically shattered the victim's limbs. The process was deliberate, ritualistic. Blows were struck at the long bones, the shin, the thigh, the forearm. Each strike broke not only bone, but the fragile illusion of human invulnerability. The sound, wooden wheel creaking, bones cracking, screams echoing, was a symphony of terror meant to imprint itself on every spectator's memory. And memory was precisely the point. The breaking wheel was not merely a punishment, it was a story written in blood and broken bodies. Its victims were displayed long after the executioner's hammer fell, their mangled remains woven through the wheel's spokes, left to hang at the castle gates or crossroads. There, crows and wolves completed the work, turning the condemned into a grisly landmark. Travellers could not pass without being reminded, here, authority reigns and disobedience ends in ruin. The wheel was more than an execution tool, it was a symbol of cosmic justice. Medieval thinkers often saw life itself as a wheel, fortune's wheel, turning kings into beggars and beggars into kings. To die on the wheel was to be cast out of the cosmic order, condemned not only by men but by fate itself. Legal codes across Europe reflected this symbolism. In the Carolina, the 16th century German criminal code rooted in earlier medieval traditions, the breaking wheel was reserved for the gravest crimes: murder, robbery, treason. To be sentenced to the wheel was to be judged beyond redemption, one's body made into a public lesson. Chroniclers describe the practice with chilling precision. In the 13th century France, the jurist Beaumanoir wrote that those condemned to the wheel must be broken alive, limb by limb, so that justice may be seen and remembered. The phrase "seen and remembered" reveals the essence. Justice in the Middle Ages was not about rehabilitation, but about spectacle, a visible memory of authority carved into flesh and bone. The breaking wheel claimed many victims, but a few became infamous enough to be remembered centuries later. One was Peter Neers, a German bandit and alleged sorcerer of the 16th century, who confessed under torture to over 500 murders. Captured after decades of terrorizing the countryside, he was executed in 1581 on the wheel in Neumarkt. According to records, his limbs were smashed in 42 separate blows before he was finally granted the mercy of a fatal strike to the chest. His remains were displayed as a warning to travellers for months afterward. Another notorious case was that of Balthazar Gerard, assassin of William the Silent, leader of the Dutch Revolt. In 1584, Gerard was executed in Delft by an especially cruel application of the wheel. His right hand was burned off with a red-hot iron, his flesh torn with pincers, his limbs shattered on the wheel, and his body left to rot on display. The cruelty was deliberate, for his crime was political as well as personal, an attack on the very idea of rebellion against sovereign power. Though these examples come from the later medieval and early modern period, they reflect a continuity of practice rooted in the feudal age, the wheel as the most terrifying form of exemplary punishment. Within the castle world, the wheel often occupied a prominent place at the outer gates or on a nearby hill, visible from the fortress walls. Lords used it to demonstrate their right of high justice, the ius gladi, or right of the sword. To display a body broken on the wheel was to declare that within these walls lay the authority to judge, condemn, and destroy. Some castles became infamous for the number of wheels that decorated their approaches. In Germany's Rhineland, travellers reported roads lined with wheels, each holding the remnants of robbers or deserters. Chroniclers note that the sight was enough to silence entire caravans into prayerful fear as they approached a lord's domain. The spectacle extended beyond sight. As bodies decomposed, the stench carried into villages and markets, reinforcing the message with every breath: crime has a smell, and justice demands it linger. The wheel was not only a secular punishment, it carried religious echoes as well. In Christian hagiography, Saint Catherine of Alexandria was famously condemned to die on a spiked wheel for defying a pagan emperor. According to legend, the wheel shattered miraculously at her touch, sparing her from that torment. Though likely apocryphal, the story spread widely, and the wheel became both an instrument of terror and an icon of sanctity. Many victims executed on the wheel were invoked in sermons as anti-Catherines, where she had triumphed by miracle, they had perished by justice. Thus, the wheel blurred lines between punishment and theology. To die upon it was to enact a dark parody of sainthood, where saints' bodies became relics, the condemned became anti-relics, reminders not of holiness, but of sin and its wages. If the Iron Maiden mocked the embrace of comfort, the wheel mocked the body itself. It revealed the skeleton beneath, turning man into broken timber. In this sense, it stripped away human dignity in a way few other punishments could. Victims were not simply killed, they were undone, their very structure shattered before their community's eyes. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas justified such punishments by emphasizing that sin disordered the soul, and thus justice could disorder the body in return. The wheel was punishment as metaphor, a disordered body symbolizing a disordered soul. Even centuries later, the breaking wheel's imagery haunted Europe. Folk tales spoke of ghostly wheels creaking at crossroads where bodies had once hung. Superstitions claimed that fragments of wheelwood could ward off thieves, while others believed they carried curses. The wheel lived on in language too. To be put on the wheel became synonymous with ultimate ruin. For medieval castles, the wheel was not simply a punishment. It was a monument of fear, visible from miles away, ensuring that the Lord's reach extended beyond walls and moats into the very imagination of his people. And yet, not all punishments were so public. Some horrors unfolded in silence, in darkness, in places where no crowd gathered and no sermon was preached. These were punishments not of spectacle, but of erasure. Chief among them was the dreaded oubliette, a hole not merely in the ground, but in memory itself. The oubliette, erased in stone and silence. If the rack and the wheel screamed their judgments across the courtyard, the oubliette whispered. Its cruelty was quieter, but in many ways more terrifying. The word itself comes from the French oublier, to forget. An oubliette was not a dungeon cell in the ordinary sense, but a hole in the castle floor, often little more than a vertical shaft carved into bedrock. Narrow, lightless, and airless, it was designed not to house prisoners, but to erase them. The condemned were lowered, or sometimes simply dropped, into these pits, which might be lined with slime, bones, or stagnant water. The shaft was too narrow to lie down, sometimes too shallow to sit, forcing the body into perpetual discomfort. Once the heavy stone cover was replaced above, the prisoner was entombed in darkness, cut off from sound, sight, and hope. Unlike the rack or wheel, the oubliette did not demand confession or offer the satisfaction of spectacle. It was punishment by negation, the denial of existence itself. To be thrown into an oubliette was to be told, in the starkest possible terms, you do not matter, you will be forgotten. Medieval castles were often honeycombed with secret chambers and shafts. The oubliette, usually placed deep within the keep or beneath a tower, was constructed with deliberate malice. Some were bell-shaped, wider at the bottom than the top, making escape impossible. Others were lined with jagged stones or iron hooks, ensuring injury during descent. A few were filled partially with water, forcing prisoners to tread endlessly until exhaustion dragged them under. Archaeological excavations in castles across France and England have uncovered pits with skeletal remains still inside, mute testimony to those who entered but never emerged. In Château de Chillon in Switzerland, a famous oubliette was carved directly into the rock floor of a chamber, its narrow mouth almost invisible until a prisoner was thrust inside. Such architecture reveals the psychology of power.
The oubliette was not built for efficiency. Keeping prisoners alive in chains was simpler. Instead, it was built for terror, for the whispered rumors that spread through villages when a troublesome rebel or rival noble simply vanished within castle walls, never to be seen again. If the wheel shattered the body, the oubliette shattered the mind. Complete darkness combined with silence broken only by dripping water or scurrying rats created sensory deprivation. Prisoners lost track of time, of day and night, of their own identity. Medieval chroniclers rarely record the voices of those who suffered oubliettes, for most left no testimony. To medieval audiences, this was horror on a cosmic level. Christianity promised judgment, heaven or hell, memory among the living and intercession among the saints. But the oubliette denied all this. A body left to rot unseen, unburied, was a soul denied its rights. The oubliette thus threatened not only the flesh, but salvation itself. Unlike common punishments such as flogging or branding, the oubliette was often reserved for political prisoners, rebellious knights, rival claimants, troublesome vassals. Executing such figures publicly risked creating martyrs. Locking them away in an oubliette solved the problem quietly. They simply ceased to exist. In Château de Loches in France, King Louis XI, nicknamed the Universal Spider for his political cunning, allegedly kept enemies in iron cages or oubliettes, ensuring that their silence preserved his reign. Chroniclers record that these cages were so small that men could not stand or lie down fully, condemned to years of cramped darkness. In England, the oubliette of Warwick Castle was notorious. Rebels captured in uprisings were said to vanish into its depths, their names stricken from record. Whether all these stories are literal truth or embroidered legend, they demonstrate how power was imagined and enforced through architecture as much as through arms. If the great hall of a castle symbolized hospitality and chivalry, the oubliette symbolized its shadow, secrecy, cruelty, domination. The knight's code spoke of honor, mercy, and noble combat. The oubliette whispered a different truth, that beneath the banners and feasts, castles could also be tombs of silence.
The existence of such pits reveals the paradox of medieval justice. On the one hand, punishment was spectacle, designed to terrify by being seen. On the other, it was sometimes erasure, designed to terrify precisely because it was unseen. Both approaches reinforced the same lesson. The Lord's power was total, whether in daylight or darkness. The oubliette was not the only silent terror. Castles also employed starvation chambers, where prisoners were locked with only a jug of water and left to waste away. Some chambers were intentionally placed near latrines, forcing the condemned to endure suffocation by stench as they slowly died. Iron cages, suspended from towers, displayed the condemned to weather and birds until their bodies withered in plain view. Branding irons marked thieves for life, while mutilations, cutting off ears, noses, or hands, turned the body into a permanent record of punishment. Each of these methods shared a common theme. They transformed the human body into a message, whether visible in scars and skeletons or invisible in silence and rumor. Castles, more than courts or cities, specialized in making punishment part of the landscape itself.
The castle as theatre of pain. As we leave behind these stone walls, it is worth asking why medieval castles, structures we often romanticize as sites of gallantry and feasts, were also homes to such cruelty. The answer lies in power. For lords and kings, punishment was not simply about correcting crime, it was about demonstrating dominance. Every rack, every wheel, every oubliette carved into rock was a line in a play where the message was clear: authority is absolute and resistance is futile. To the medieval imagination, justice was inseparable from theatre. Pain was not hidden but displayed. Death was not private but communal. The castle courtyard was as much a stage as the tournament ground, and on that stage, the condemned became unwilling actors in a drama of order versus chaos, obedience versus rebellion. Modern readers may recoil at the cruelty of these punishments, yet to understand them is to glimpse the medieval mind, its fears of disorder, its obsession with symbolism, its conviction that justice must be seen and felt. The castle was never only stone and mortar, it was ritual, myth, and spectacle. As the philosopher Michel Foucault observed centuries later, punishment in pre-modern societies was a ceremony of power. It was less about the individual criminal than about the community that watched and the sovereign who commanded. So the next time you walk through the ruins of a medieval castle, pause before the dungeon stairs or the narrow shafts carved in stone. Imagine the silence of the oubliette, the creak of the rack, the clang of the Iron Maiden, the crack of the wheel. Beneath the romance of knights and banners lies a darker story, the story of how pain was used to govern. As one medieval chronicler wrote, "The castle is a crown upon the land, but it is also a grave for those who forget their place." And with that grim reminder, we close our journey through the most horrifying punishments used in medieval castles. Until next time, Vale, farewell.